The world did not stop spinning when Anya died. That was the first cruel realization that hit Zayyar. Outside his window, cars still drove by, people still laughed, and the sun still rose every morning with an indifferent brilliance. But inside his apartment, time had frozen on the exact second the doctor looked down and said, "I'm sorry." The weight of silence. Zayyar sat on the edge of his unmade bed, staring at his reflection in the full-length mirror. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. His eyes, once bright and full of life whenever Anya was near, were now hollow, bloodshot, and sunken. Dark circles ringed them like bruises from a fight he had lost long ago. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. The hunger didn't register anymore, it was entirely consumed by the physical ache in his chest. It was a literal, throbbing pain right behind his breastbone, so intense that he often pressed his fist against it, trying to hold his heart together. How can a physical body contain this much sorrow without bursting open? He whispered to the empty room. His voice was raw, scratched from hours of silent screaming. Every single object in the apartment was a landmine of memories. The kitchen counter, where she had tried to bake a cake for his birthday, ending up with flour all over her nose and laughing so hard she cried. The blue armchair, where she used to curl up with her books, occasionally looking up just to smile at him. The balcony, where they had shared countless cups of tea, talking about a future that would never exist. The breaking point. As the clock struck midnight, the absolute silence of the apartment became too heavy to bear. It pressed down on his chest, suffocating him. He walked over to the closet and pulled out a box he had sworn never to open. Inside were her things, her favorite oversized woolen sweater, her sketchbooks, and a small silver bracelet she wore every single day. He lifted the sweater to his face and inhaled deeply. The faint, lingering scent of lavender and vanilla hit him, and it was like a dam breaking inside his soul. A violent sob tore through his throat. He fell to his knees on the hard floor, clutching the sweater to his chest as if he could pull her back into existence through the fabric. "Anya, please," he choked out, his body convulsing with tears. "Please don't leave me here. I can't do this alone. I don't know how to breathe without you." The tears poured down his face, hot and unstoppable, soaking into the wool. He cried until his lungs burned, until his throat felt like sandpaper, and until his stomach knotted in agony. It was the kind of weeping that hollows a person out, leaving nothing but a shell behind. He curled into a fetal position on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, trapped in the nightmare of his own reality. The birth of fear. Hours passed, and the storm of his tears slowly subsided into quiet, ragged breathing. As he lay there in the dark, cold and exhausted, a sinister realization began to take root in his mind. The pain he was feeling right now was directly proportional to the love he had given. Because he had loved Anya with every fiber of his being, her absence was tearing his soul apart. Love wasn't a blessing, it was a trap. It was an agreement to hand someone a weapon and trust them not to use it, only for fate to steal that weapon and stab you in the heart anyway. The resolution. He decided, right there on the cold floor, that he would never let anyone close again. The defense mechanism. If he never loved, he would never have to lose. If he kept his heart behind a wall of stone, no one could ever break it again. The new reality. He didn't just dislike the idea of romance anymore, he was absolutely terrified of it. The mere thought of opening up to someone filled him with a cold, paralyzing panic. He had survived the crash, but Zayyar knew the truth. The man he used to be had died in that hospital room alongside Anya. The passage of time. 3 months later, Zayyar was forced to return to work. He couldn't afford to lose his job, even if he felt like a ghost walking among the living. He dragged himself through the daily routine like a machine, waking up, putting on a suit, sitting at his desk, and staring at spreadsheets for 8 hours without registering a single number. His colleagues noticed the change. The once warm, approachable Zayyar had become completely unapproachable. He wore an invisible armor of cold politeness. When people asked how he was doing, he gave a curt, tight smile and said, "I'm fine," before walking away. When invited out for coffee or lunch, he always had an excuse ready. He avoided eye contact, avoided casual conversations, and avoided anything that could remotely lead to a human connection. He was safe in his isolation. Or so he thought, until a new project forced him into close proximity with the company's new graphic designer, Maya. Maya was quiet, observant, and possessed a gentle patience that Zayyar's walls weren't prepared for. Unlike the others, she didn't push him to talk, nor did she look at him with the suffocating pity he so deeply hated. She simply existed in his space, a calm presence that slowly began to threaten the frozen fortress he had built around his heart. Chapter 2. The Fracture in the Armor. The rainy season returned, bringing with it the exact same gray skies that had haunted Zayyar for months. Every drop of rain hitting the office windows sounded like a countdown to a panic attack. Zayyar sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. His computer screen reflected a face that looked increasingly hollowed out by sleeplessness. Across the glass partition of the conference room sat Maya. She was adjusting the color grading on a set of architectural renders, completely absorbed in her work. She didn't try to be loud. She didn't offer him pitying glances like the HR managers who spoke to him in hushed, patronizing tones. But her presence was undeniable. It was a quiet, steady warmth that felt incredibly dangerous to a man who had committed to freezing to death. The shared deadline. Zayyar. The project files for the drone photogrammetry layout need to be compiled before the 6 p.m. presentation, Maya's voice broke through his thoughts. She was standing at the edge of his cubicle, holding a notebook close to her chest. I'm on it, Zayyar replied smoothly, keeping his tone entirely devoid of emotion. He didn't look up at her. He kept his eyes locked onto the glowing monitor, fearing that even a moment of eye contact might reveal the absolute chaos raging beneath his calm exterior. You've been skipping lunch, she noted gently. It wasn't an accusation, it was just a quiet observation. There's a cafe downstairs that makes decent tea. You look like you could use a break. Zayyar's grip on his mouse tightened until his knuckles turned white. A break. A break meant letting his guard down. Letting his guard down meant thinking. And thinking always brought back the smell of hospital corridors and the cold weight of a lifeless hand. I have too much work to finish, Maya. Thank you, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, sharper, a deliberate warning shot to push her away. Maya didn't look offended, she simply nodded, her expression soft but laced with a profound sadness that suggested she, too, understood what it meant to carry an invisible weight. Don't burn yourself out, she murmured before walking back to her desk. The meltdown. By 7:30 p.m., the office had completely emptied out. The overhead fluorescent lights had been switched off, leaving only the desk lamps casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Zayyar stayed behind, deliberately working late to avoid going back to an empty apartment where Anya's ghost waited in every corner. He stood up to stretch his stiff muscles and walked toward the break room to grab a glass of water. As he stepped inside, his heel caught on a loose cable near the printing station. He stumbled, trying to catch his balance, and knocked over a ceramic mug left on the counter. Shatter. The sound of the ceramic exploding against the tiled floor echoed violently through the silent office. Zayyar froze. The sound of breaking ceramic instantly morphed in his mind into the screeching sound of tearing metal, the shattering of a car windshield, and the deafening bang of an airbag inflating. His breath caught in his throat. His lungs suddenly refused to expand. No, he gasped, clutching his chest. He backed away from the broken shards, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The walls of the break room felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating him, crushing the air straight out of his body. He dropped to his knees right beside the mess, his hands shaking so violently he could barely control them. He began frantically trying to pick up the broken pieces with his bare hands, desperately needing to fix it, to undo the noise, to undo the memory. Zayyar, stop, you're going to cut yourself. A pair of hands gently but firmly grabbed his wrists, pulling him away from the sharp edges. It was Maya. She had stayed late too, finishing up her design layouts. Let go of me. Zayyar panicked, trying to wrench his hands free. His voice was laced with pure, unadulterated terror. I need to clean it. I need to fix it. Why couldn't I fix it? Zayyar, breathe, look at me, just breathe, Maya pleaded. She didn't let go of his wrists, but she didn't pull him either. She just anchored him to the floor, her voice a steady lifeline in the middle of his drowning mind. The raw outpour. The resistance left his body all at once. The adrenaline evaporated, leaving behind a bottomless pit of exhaustion and grief. Zayyar collapsed forward, his forehead resting against Maya's shoulder as a devastating sob ripped through his chest. It wasn't a normal cry. It was a guttural, agonizing sound of a soul that had been holding its breath for an entire year. Greater than, it hurts so bad, Maya, he wept openly, his pride completely shattered, his carefully constructed walls turning to dust in a single second. It hurts every single day. I can't look at the rain without seeing her. I can't sleep because the silence screams at me. I'm so tired of being alive while she's not. Greater than. Maya didn't say a single word. She didn't offer hollow platitudes like, time heals all wounds, or she's in a better place. She simply wrapped her arms around his trembling shoulders, letting him ruin her blouse with his hot, endless tears. She held him on that cold breakroom floor while he poured out the toxic grief he had kept locked away for so long. The vulnerability matrix. Zayyar's walls cold politeness, isolation, overworking. Filled down pointing triangle triggered by the shattering sound. The breakthrough panic attack, loss of control. Filled down pointing triangle Maya's response. The core truth admitting the pain out loud to another human being. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the entire building was the devastating weeping of a broken man. Zayyar cried until he had no tears left, until his body felt completely hollowed out, empty and exposed. The emergence of the ultimate fear. Eventually, the crying stopped. Zayyar slowly pulled away, his face pale, his eyes swollen and bloodshot. He looked at Maya's shoulder, soaked through with his tears, and then looked into her eyes. In her eyes, there was no judgment. There was only a profound, beautiful empathy. She reached out her hand, her thumb gently brushing away a stray tear from his cheek. The moment her skin touched his, a jolt of pure horror went straight through Zayyar's veins. He pulled back violently, as if he had been burned by an open flame. His breathing caught again, but this time, it wasn't from the grief of the past, it was from the terror of the present. He saw the way she looked at him. He felt the terrifying warmth of her comfort. And in that split second, his mind screamed a horrific warning. If you let her in, if you grow to need her, the universe will take her away too. You will love her, and then you will watch her die. Don't, Zayyar whispered, his voice trembling as he stood up awkwardly, backing away from her. Don't look at me like that. Don't touch me. Zayyar, I'm just trying to help, Maya started, standing up with her hands raised in a peaceful gesture. I don't want your help, he yelled, his voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of anger and fear. Stay away from me, Maya. I mean it. Don't come near me, don't talk to me about anything other than work. Just, leave me alone. He turned around and practically ran out of the office, leaving Maya standing alone in the dim breakroom, surrounded by broken ceramic and the lingering echo of his agonizing fear. The isolation deepens. Zayyar drove home recklessly, the windshield wipers slapping furiously against the glass as the rain poured down harder. His hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that he could barely keep the car straight. When he reached his apartment, he didn't turn on the lights. He locked the front door with 3 separate locks, threw his keys onto the floor, and slid down against the wood until he was sitting in the dark. He clutched his head, pulling at his hair as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just grieving Anya anymore. He was terrified of Maya. He was terrified of the fact that for a brief, fleeting second, her touch had actually made the pain feel a little bit lighter. And that lightness was the most dangerous thing in the world. The cruel logic. To feel better meant moving on. Moving on meant forgetting Anya. Forgetting Anya meant losing her all over again. The guardrail. He would rather live in absolute, agonizing misery for the rest of his life than risk loving someone else and facing this destruction a second time. He pulled his knees to his chest in the dark corner of his living room, weeping silently into the fabric of his trousers, completely trapped in a prison of his own making, where the doors were locked from the inside, and the warden was his own paralyzing fear of love. Chapter 3. The Cold War in the Field Lines. The following Monday, the office felt different. The air was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that centered around the corner cubicle where Zayyar sat. He had arrived an hour earlier than usual, deliberately avoiding the morning rush, deliberately avoiding the possibility of crossing paths with Maya in the elevator. He had spent the entire weekend reinforcing his mental fortress. Every tear he had shed on the breakroom floor was now a source of deep, burning shame. He had shown his weakness. He had let someone see the raw, bleeding core of his trauma, and to Zayyar, that was an unacceptable tactical failure. The silent treatment. When Maya walked into the office at 8:50 a.m., she paused near his desk. She looked tired, her usual bright energy dimmed by a cloud of anxiety. She held a fresh cup of coffee in her hand, leaning forward slightly as if to speak. Zayyar didn't give her the chance. The moment he sensed her presence, he stood up, grabbed a stack of printed topographic maps, and walked past her without a single word, his shoulder brushing past hers so coldly it felt like a physical slap. He spent the rest of the day hiding behind emails. The communication shift. If Maya needed an acid approved, he replied with one-word emails. Approved, asterisk or asterisk, fix. Asterisk. The physical barrier. He wore his noise-canceling headphones all day, even when no music was playing, using them as a literal do not disturb sign. The avoidance. He timed his restroom breaks and water runs to ensure the hallways were entirely empty. Maya tried twice to approach him during the afternoon. The first time, she stood by his desk and quietly said, "Zayyar, about Thursday night. If it's not about the drone photogrammetry data for the new sector, I don't have time." "Maya," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerously sharp whisper, not even looking up from his monitor. She swallowed hard, her lower lip trembling slightly before she nodded and walked away. Zayyar felt a sharp pang of guilt pierce through his chest, but he quickly crushed it. Good, asterisk, he told himself. Let her hate me, it's safer for both of us. Asterisk, ### forced proximity. The corporate world, however, has a cruel way of destroying defenses. On Wednesday morning, their department head called an emergency meeting. The client for the Hillside development project wants a comprehensive aerial survey and acid inspection done by tomorrow night, the manager announced, slamming a thick folder onto the table. The weather forecast says the heavy rain is clearing up out in the valley for a 12-hour window tomorrow. I need our best surveyor and our best data visualizer on the ground to map the terrain manually. Zayyar felt a cold dread pool in his stomach. He already knew what was coming. Zayyar, you're handling the manual flight control and drone operations. Maya, you're going with him to log the coordinates and process the visual data on site. I want you two in a company vehicle by 6 a.m. tomorrow. Zayyar stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. Sir, I can handle the site visit alone. I don't need a designer on field. I can log the data manually and bring it back. The client wants real-time adjustments, Zayyar, the manager replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Maya goes with you. Meeting adjourned. Zayyar looked across the table. Maya was staring down at her notepad, tightly gripping her pen. She didn't look at him, but her knuckles were white. ### the journey into the fog. The drive to the valley the next morning was an exercise in psychological torture. The company SUV cut through the thick, early morning fog creeping off the mountains. The only sound inside the cabin was the steady, rhythmic clicking of the windshield wipers wiping away the morning dew. 2 hours of absolute, suffocating silence. Zayyar kept his eyes locked on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel at a perfect 10-2 position. His chest felt tight. Being trapped in a moving vehicle with Maya felt exactly like being trapped in a cage with his own fears. Maya sat in the passenger seat, staring out the side window at the passing gray landscape. She looked incredibly small wrapped in her thick winter jacket. You don't have to treat me like a monster, Zayyar, she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. Zayyar didn't look at her. I don't treat you like anything, Maya. I am performing my professional duties. You're punishing me for being there when you broke down, she said, her voice cracking slightly as she finally turned her head to look at him. I didn't plan for that to happen. I didn't ask to see you cry. But I didn't judge you either. Why are you acting like I committed a crime by caring? Because I didn't ask you to care. Zayyar snapped, his voice suddenly exploding in the quiet car, his anger a shield against the vulnerability creeping back into his throat. I don't want your empathy, Maya. I don't want your understanding. I just want to do my job, go home to my empty apartment, and be left alone. Is that so difficult for you to understand? Why? She demanded, tears finally welling up in her eyes, flashing with a mixture of anger and deep hurt. Why are you so terrified of a little bit of human kindness? What happened to you that made you hate the world this much? You don't know anything about me. Then tell me, she cried out, a single tear spilling over her eyelashes and tracing a wet line down her cheek. Tell me so I can stop stepping on landmines every time I breathe around you. The girl I loved died in my arms, Maya. Zayyar roared, his voice breaking violently as he slammed his hand against the steering wheel. The car veered slightly before he corrected it, his breathing fast and ragged. Anya died. She was everything to me, and she was ripped away in a single second. And every time you look at me with those soft, sympathetic eyes, every time you try to make me feel better, you are pulling me toward a cliff I refuse to jump off again. I cannot love anyone else. I cannot risk losing anyone else. It will kill me. Do you hear me? It will literally kill me. The sudden, brutal confession hung in the air like a heavy fog. Maya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at him, her heart breaking for the sheer volume of agony rolling off him. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't cold, it was bleeding. The breakdown on the hillside. They reached the survey site in silence. The valley was beautiful but desolate, surrounded by steep rocky cliffs and covered in wet, slippery mud from the previous days of rain. Zayyar immediately threw himself into work, using the physical labor to burn off the toxic adrenaline coursing through his veins. He unpacked the heavy drone equipment, calibrated the manual flight controls, and checked the photogrammetry sensors with aggressive, frantic movements. Maya stayed several paces behind him, her face pale, her eyes red. She quietly set up the field laptop on a folding table, her hands trembling so badly she dropped her stylus twice into the mud. Launching drone for Sector Alpha, Zayyar announced mechanically, ignoring the raw ache in his throat. The quadcopter hummed to life, lifting into the gray sky, buzzing loudly as it began its automated grid pattern over the cliffside. Zayyar watched the controller screen intently, monitoring the flight path. Suddenly, a sharp, unpredicted gust of wind swept through the valley, howling against the rocky walls. The drone tilted violently, its proximity sensors screaming a warning on Zayyar's screen. "The wind is destabilizing the secondary rotors," Zayyar muttered, his fingers flying across the manual joysticks to stabilize the craft. "Maya, log the telemetry data and force a return to home command from the laptop." Maya didn't answer. "Maya, force the command now," he yelled, looking up from his screen. He turned around, and his heart instantly stopped. Maya wasn't at the table. She had stepped closer to the edge of the rocky ridge to get a clearer line of sight for the signal booster, but the wet clay beneath her boots had given way. She was sliding down the steep, muddy incline toward a 20-foot drop into a rocky ravine. Her fingers were desperately clawing at the wet grass, her laptop tumbling over the edge, smashing into the rocks below. "Zayyar!" she screamed, her voice filled with pure, terrifying panic as her grip slipped. "Zayyar, help me!" For a fraction of a second, the universe warped. The gray valley disappeared. Zayyar wasn't on a hill anymore. He was back in the shattered wreckage of his car, the smell of gasoline in the air, watching Anya's eyes slowly close as life drained out of her. "Don't leave me, Zayyar," the memory screamed in his ears. "No." A primal, terrified roar tore out of Zayyar's chest. He dropped the drone controller completely into the mud, ignoring the sound of the expensive machine crashing somewhere in the trees. He ran. He didn't care about his own safety, he didn't care about the slippery mud, he didn't care about the walls he had built. He threw himself down onto the edge of the muddy slope, sliding on his stomach, extending his right arm as far as it could humanly go. "Maya, give me your hand, grab me," he screamed, his face contorted in an expression of absolute, agonizing terror. Maya lunged upward, her muddy fingers wrapping around his wrist. Zayyar locked his fingers around her arm with a grip so tight it would leave bruises for weeks. He dug his boots into the solid rock at the top of the ridge, his muscles straining to the absolute limit, his veins popping against his neck as he dragged her up by sheer force of adrenaline and panic. With one final, desperate heave, he pulled her over the lip of the ridge. The aftermath of terror. They both collapsed onto the wet grass, covered in mud, rain beginning to drizzle down on them once more. Maya was hyperventilating, sobbing hysterically as she clutched her bruised arm, her entire body shaking from the near-death experience. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," the ground just slid, she choked out through her tears. But Zayyar wasn't listening. He was sitting on his knees, staring at his hands, breathing so hard it sounded like his lungs were tearing apart. The terror hadn't left him. It had multiplied by 1,000. He looked at Maya, alive, crying, breathing, and the realization of how close he had just come to watching another person die right in front of him shattered the remaining pieces of his sanity. The universe had just shown him exactly what he feared most, that he did care. If he hadn't cared, his heart wouldn't be beating this fast. If he hadn't cared, he wouldn't have run. He had failed his own rule. He had let her become important enough to panic over. "Zayyar." Maya reached out a trembling, muddy hand toward him, her eyes full of gratitude and concern. "You saved me, thank you." "Get away from me," Zayyar whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He backed away from her on his hands and knees, his eyes wide with a terrifying, wild panic. "Zayyar, please, I said stay away," he screamed, his voice echoing brutally across the empty valley. He stood up, stumbling over his own feet, his hands pressed against his ears as if trying to shut out the sound of his own racing heart. "Don't look at me, Don't thank me. I don't want this. I don't want any of this. He turned around and ran back toward the SUV, leaving everything behind, the equipment, the maps, and Maya. He threw himself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed his forehead against the steering wheel, crying so violently that his chest felt like it was being cracked open with a hammer. The climax of fear. Filled down pointing triangle, filled down pointing triangle. The reality of loss, the reality of care. Anya's death made saving Maya proved him freeze. Still has something to lose. He was completely trapped. He couldn't stay away from her because his soul wouldn't let her die, but he couldn't let her close because the fear of losing her was a living monster eating him alive from the inside out. Chapter 4. The final break in the healing scar. The drive back from the valley was completely silent, but it was a silence filled with a heavy, suffocating finality. The rain had stopped, leaving behind an eerie, pale twilight that cast long shadows across the highway. Maya sat as far away from Zayyar as the passenger seat allowed, staring blankly out the window, her quiet tears dry now, leaving pale streaks through the dried mud on her face. Zayyar kept his eyes glued to the asphalt ahead. His hands were locked so tightly on the steering wheel that they had lost all color. The agonizing panic attack had left him completely hollowed out, an empty, burnt-out shell of a man. When they finally pulled into the company parking lot, Zayyar turned off the engine but kept his hands on the wheel. He didn't look at her. Tomorrow morning, I am submitting my formal request to transfer to the Remote Surveying Division in the Northern Territory, Zayyar said, his voice flat, completely devoid of any human warmth. It was the voice of a dead man walking. I will be gone by the end of the week. You won't have to deal with me, or my baggage, ever again. Maya didn't move for a long time. Then, she slowly turned her head to look at him. There was no anger left in her eyes, only a profound, devastating pity that cut deeper than any insult could. You think you're saving yourself, Zayyar, she said quietly, her voice trembling but steady. But you're not. You're just building your own coffin while you're still breathing. I hope one day you find the courage to live instead of just hiding from death. She opened the door, stepped out into the chilly evening air, and walked away without looking back. Zayyar watched her figure disappear into the office building through the rearview mirror. A single, heavy tear finally broke free from his eye and rolled down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. The departure into exile. True to his word, Zayyar left. He packed his entire life into 3 cardboard boxes, gave up his apartment, and took a position in a remote mountain outpost where his only companions were the cold winds, the barren peaks, and his surveying equipment. Months blurred into a relentless, icy routine. The days, spent entirely in isolation, navigating rugged cliffs and operating drones over vast, empty valleys. The nights, spent in a small, wooden cabin, sitting by a crackling fire that provided warmth to his body but did nothing for the frozen wasteland inside his chest. He thought the distance would give him peace. He thought that by completely removing himself from Maya's world, the terrifying fear of caring would wither away. But isolation is a double-edged sword. Without the distractions of the city, his mind became an echoing chamber where memories of both Anya and Maya played on a loop. He remembered Anya's laughter, but now, he also remembered the desperate, fierce terror he felt when he caught Maya's hand at the edge of the cliff. He realized, with a crushing weight, that his fear hadn't protected him from anything. It hadn't brought Anya back, and it hadn't stopped him from hurting. It had simply robbed him of the only beautiful thing left in human existence, the willingness to reach out in the dark. 1 year later, the letter. A year passed in this frozen exile. One evening, a supply truck arrived at his outpost, bringing winter rations and a small bundle of redirected mail from the central office. Among the bills and corporate memos was a small, cream-colored envelope. Zayyar's heart stopped when he saw the neat, precise handwriting on the front. It was from Maya. With trembling fingers, he sat down by the fireplace and opened it. A small photograph fell out first. It was a picture of the finished hillside project they had worked on. The desolate, muddy valley was now a beautiful, green community park, completely transformed. Behind it was a brief note. Greater than Zayyar, greater than the project is finally complete. When I look at this park, I don't remember the mud or the fall. I only remember the hand that reached out and refused to let me go. Greater than I don't hold any grudges, and I never did. I just wanted you to know that the world is still beautiful, even after a storm. You don't have to stay in the dark forever. Your heart didn't break because you loved Anya, it broke because love is real, and it matters. Whenever you're ready to stop running, the world is still here. Asterisk. Greater than take care of yourself. The breaking of the ice. Zayyar held the letter close to his chest. He looked at the crackling fire, and for the first time in over 2 years, the tears that filled his eyes weren't bitter or terrifying. They were soft, cleansing, and full of a profound release. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. He just sat by the fire and let himself weep openly, letting the warm tears melt the thick layer of ice that had encased his soul for so long. The evolution of the heart. Filled down pointing triangle, filled down pointing triangle. The frozen cage past, the living scar present. Avoidance and isolation, acceptance of pain. Terrified of loss, willingness to hope. Living like a ghost, embracing the world again. He finally understood the great, tragic truth of existence. You cannot negotiate with grief. You cannot lock your heart away to keep it safe from pain, because to protect yourself from pain is to protect yourself from love, from joy, from life itself. The return. The next morning, the sun rose over the snow-capped mountains with a blinding, beautiful brilliance. Zayyar packed his bags. He walked out of the cabin, leaving the barren peaks behind, and stepped into the transport truck heading back down to the city. He still carried the heavy scars of his past. Anya's loss would always be a part of who he was, and the fear of the unknown hadn't completely vanished. But as the truck wound down the mountain road toward civilization, Zayyar looked out the window and took a deep, full breath. His chest still ached, but it was the ache of a heart that was finally beating again. He was done running. He was ready to face the world, ready to face his grief, and finally, desperately, ready to face the beautiful terror of love.